Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We will be covering 4 different topics. So the first one is going to be about Cody Bellinger and the blockbuster news over the weekend that he is returning to Chicago. The second part is going to be about the updates on the other free agents on the market, how will Bellinger re-signing affect them, and just overall rumors about them in general. Then we'll be talking about some recent spring training stories that happened over the weekend and also today before I started streaming. And finally, we'll be talking about some other news around the league that I thought was important, but maybe didn't deserve its own segment entirely. So now, before we do that, I would like to ask you to please like and follow the show. We get a number of requests from viewers, so to ensure that your question gets read by me and gets on top of the list, please use the link on the screen you see, streamelements.com/GSMC Sports Network /tip. It really does help the show, and it really does mean a lot for me and the channel and everyone else involved. So thank you so much for that. All right, so let's get into our first topic today, and that is going to be about Cody Bellinger. We finally have some movement on the free agent market and involving the Boris 4, and it is about Bellinger and him returning to his old team, the Chicago Cubs. Now, we were waiting for what the first domino to fall would be in regards to Boris and the free agents that are still in the market that are signed by, that are represented by him. And we finally got it with Cody Bellinger going back to the north side. So this had been rumored for a little while now. Bellinger and the Cubs just made a logical sense with his market kind of faltering and him being very comfortable in Chicago last year, him having a bounce-back season after the years of futility he had with the Dodgers. It just made sense, and it finally does come to fruition here over the weekend, very early in the morning on Sunday. So the basis of the deal is 3 years, $80 million. There's 2 opt-outs after the first 2 years, of course, and it is $30 million in the first 2 years and then $20 million in the last. That's just the basis of the contract. Bellinger, after seeking a long-term deal and not getting it, he takes a sort of prove-yourself contract where he gets that 1-year deal, which is the basis of it, and if he struggles, he can get the second-year option or even the third. Hopefully it doesn't come to that for him because it will be better for his career, but of course. So if he is good next year, he gets to opt out and gets to hit the market again and hopefully prove to teams, that wasn't a fluke. I'm really back. I really am the Cody Bellinger of the Dodgers once again. And he gets the big contract he was looking for, hopefully for him. I think when you're looking at this contract, there's going to be natural comparisons to another guy who took a similar contract, with that, of course, being Carlos Correa. Correa also was on the market for a long time looking for the long-term deal that he never got, and instead he compromised and took a short-term deal with the Twins, which he eventually opted out of after 1 year, and then re-signed on a long-term deal with them after 2 failed attempts to go to 2 different teams. But we all know of the Correa situation. That was old story. So just some general thoughts on this deal for the Cubs and for Bellinger. I find it very interesting that Bellinger and especially Boris finally gave in and took a short-term contract and didn't take the long-term deal that they were looking for. Maybe 7 to 8 years, $300 million, something like that, which Boris probably thought he was worth because of the season he had last year and his track record. You look at Boris and just what he's done over his career. This is not something he does often, and I think it's a mixture of him realizing, okay, I think the times are different now with a lot more analytics, a lot more information teams have. They're going to realize these players who, they're not worth the contracts that teams would give them in the past. Now, Cody Bellinger is still a really good player, but there are a lot of, concerns you have with him. One of course, being that we heard about the Yankees and why they didn't want to bring him in was that because he didn't really hit the ball particularly hard last year, and that could show some signs of luck and some signs of regression going into the future. And, just that he may not be able to live up to the contract that a team gave him. And I think a lot of teams saw that. And they were like, okay, if we're going to give out a monster contract, it's not going to be this guy. If you're a smaller market team, like you have teams like the Yankees, like the Mets, like the Dodgers, teams like that, you can give out long-term, huge contracts every single year. But if you're, more of a mid-market team or something like that, that necessarily isn't a small market, but isn't, a New York or an LA, you maybe give a big long-term contract to a superstar once every 5-6 years, something like that. And I don't think teams wanted to give it to Bellinger. I don't think they thought of him as that kind of guy. So I think it makes sense that he took this short-term deal. Again, it's going to be very interesting now to see if this is what Boris does in the future, especially with his clients that are still in the market. We're going to talk about it in the next segment. So I'm not going to get ahead of myself. But Yeah, I mean, it's a huge deal that Boris finally gave in and took one of these short-term contracts, and it's really interesting that he did. So now, just looking at how this deal makes sense with the Cubs, again, I think this is what was going to happen for a little while now. It kind of just made sense with all the rumors and where everything was going. There were some rumors a few days ago that he had signed with the Cubs. Obviously, those turned out to be true because he's now signed with the Cubs. So congrats to that person who got a very random scoop. Yeah, I think it's a good move for the Cubs because obviously Cody Bellinger is a very good player. We can talk about all the things about him regressing in the future and all that kind of stuff. But as of right now and where he is a very good player, and I think any team would be lucky to have him on their team. I don't think anyone's really disputing that. And just the fit for the Cubs, I think it does make a lot of sense. Bellinger has a lot of versatility, which I think is something that a lot of players on the Cubs do have. You have guys like Michael Busch, like Christopher Morel, like Seiya Suzuki, guys who can play multiple different positions and don't really have a set position, can kind of move around the infield or the outfield a little bit. And I just think it's going to be very interesting to where Cody Bellinger does play. I'm assuming he's going to play at first base because of someone I've talked about a lot on the show who I'm really a huge fan of, and that is Pico Armstrong. He is looking to be the future of center field for the Cubs, and I don't think they're going to block him with Bellinger, who might be a short-term deal. Bellinger obviously has played first a long time in his career. He's kind of moved around with first and the outfield spots, and it makes a lot of sense for him to play at first. The only problem I see with it is you're kind of taking away a lot of his value by playing him at first because he is such a great defender in center. But I think Pico Armstrong, again, is the future of that position for the Cubs, so it only makes sense to put Bellinger at first. You put Bellinger at first, you probably move Michael Busch to DH. You now have Christopher Morel at third. You have Nico Horner at second. Dansby Swanson at short. Yan Gomes, Miguel Amaya at center. You have, of course, Pico Armstrong, who I believe will be on the opening day roster, at center. You now have Seiya Suzuki and Ian Happ in the corners. And I think that's a really great lineup. I mean, adding Bellinger, of course, adds another great bat to that lineup. You have the flexibility now to move Michael Busch or even Seiya Suzuki or someone like that to DH. Maybe can rotate with those guys, him, Christopher Morel, Seiya, to give him days off and try to hit very well. So I think this Cubs lineup is pretty much set. I think they could upgrade at third base specifically, which we will talk about again next segment. I think that's really the only thing. But right now, I think the Cubs lineup is really set. I think it's a pretty nice lineup. And I think the Bellinger deal really helps. He was obviously very comfortable in Chicago last year with the season he had. He obviously likes it there if he is coming back. And I think it makes a lot of sense for Bellinger to go back, and I think it's a really good fit for both player and team. Now, I think the contract's a great fit as well. So like I said, I think Bellinger is a very good player, but I just don't know how he factors into the Cubs' long-term plans simply because of Pico Armstrong and because of all the young bats they do have. So assuming Bellinger has another great season, which I don't think is a certainty, but I think it's likely because he is a good player, he opts out of that $30 million. He gets a big long-term contract from another team and moves on. And the Cubs now easily can put Pico Armstrong back in center and stay in center. You can have Michael Busch be your first baseman, assuming he works out there. Christopher Morel can play third. You can keep Seiya in the corner, and you can add a full-time DH or something like that. Maybe even go for a long-term bid for a guy like Juan Soto next year. I mean, if Bellinger opts out, you have a lot of financial flexibility, so I think that would make a lot of sense. So I think it made sense for Bellinger to come back, especially on a short-term contract. I'm sure that both him and the Cubs are hoping that he has a great season and can opt out. And if he does struggle, he now has that fallback of, okay, I'm going to get $30 million next year, and then I can opt out next year if I rebound. And if he doesn't, he gets $20 million. But if he continues to struggle, we'll probably ask about his long-term future in the league after that. But if he does struggle, the Cubs still aren't on the hook for that much. It's only 3 years, and it is a lot of money. But at the same time, I do think Bellinger's floor is a bit high for most players just because of how good his defense is. Now, again, that changes a little bit because he's probably not going to be playing center. But he's still a really good player, as I've said multiple times now. And it's a good deal for the Cubs to bring him back. You had a big splash earlier in the offseason with Craig Counsell bringing him into manager. And you hadn't really done anything after that would be considered, kind of matching that up as your big splash. You brought in Shoto Minaga, who is a good player, but not like a superstar you're going to build around, and had some, questions about his contract and physical coming over from Japan. You had Hector Neris, who's a good bullpen arm, but again, not something that's going to really excite the fan base to a new degree. But I think bringing back Bellinger really does that. He's very much beloved in Chicago. A lot of people are big fans of him. They love his redemption story. He's always seemed like a very likable player in his career in the league. So yeah, I think it's a good move for Bellinger and the Cubs to bring him back. And I'm very excited to see what happens. Again, I think this is a really nice lineup. I think adding a big bat to the middle of the order made a ton of sense, and I'm glad it was Bellinger because obviously he has a relationship with the Cubs and the fan base, so it just made so much sense. So yeah, I'm looking forward to watching the Cubs. This doesn't move them, in my opinion, to the number one team in the NL Central. To me, that's still the Reds, just because of all the amount of young talent they have on that team. The bullpen was added to with one of the best closers in baseball, a really good starting rotation that they added to. But I think the Cubs are definitely in the mix for a wild card spot. And, if you're a Cubs fan, you haven't really haven't had a winning season that was significant in a little while since that World Series run. You've had some nice games, some nice wins, some nice playoff games, but nothing really to, you strung together. So maybe this is the year for the Cubs, if not, I definitely think they still have a future going for them. They still have a lot to work with. You have building blocks of guys like Dansby Swanson, like Nico Horner, like Seiya Suzuki, like B. Crow Armstrong, like Ian Happ. Justin Steele almost won the Cy Young last year. So the pieces are there, and I think it's just adding stuff around the edges, and I think Bellinger is definitely a very significant piece to add to that. So, again, I really like the move. I think it made the most sense for Bellinger where he was in this market because there wasn't really a clear team that could have brought him in other than the Cubs. You had teams like the Phillies who were mentioned, the Angels. They were mentioned, but they were kind of awkward fits that you were kind of forcing just to get a big player in your team. So I'm glad he went back to Chicago. I thought it was the most natural fit, and it makes sense for both the player and the team, and I think the contract is good as well. So I'm happy about that. Again, I think the Cubs are going to be a really good team, but I'm not sure if they're going to be top of the NL Central now. You look at this division, as I've said multiple times on this episode and other episodes as well, I'm very high on the Reds. I love that team. I love all the young amounts of talent they have. I'm really excited to watch them, so I would still have them first. The NL Central is a very strange division because there's not really a standout team, but none of the teams in that division are horrible. They're definitely not horrible. You have, other than the Cubs and the Reds, you have the Pirates who, people might just look at and, not really take seriously because they're the Pirates and they've kind of had this reputation for a little bit. But they have a lot of good young talent that's coming into this roster. When you're really bad for a really long time, young talent's bound to come in, and that's what's finally happening. You have guys like Paul Skeens who are going to come up probably in the majors this year. A guy like Henry Davis was the first overall pick. Other young players as well to build around, like Liero Peguero. You just extended Mitch Keller to be a forefront of that pitching staff for a little while. So the Pirates definitely have a lot of pieces, and I would look for them to be, maybe a surprise team in the NL Central this year. I don't have them winning it, but again, crazier things have happened. The Marlins made the playoffs last year, so if that can happen, I definitely think the Pirates could, or even win the division if, something crazy happens. You have the Cardinals, who are really interesting. Obviously, they've had a lot of pitching issues the past few years. They think they've added to it this offseason, signing Sonny Gray, Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe they know something about those guys that I don't. But they have such an array of young bats that it's really incredible the amount of talent there is there for those bats. They also made a signing, so we're going to talk about that later in the show, but I'm sure if you're a baseball fan, you probably know what that signing is at this point. I'm very high on the Cardinals' bats. It's just a matter of getting that pitching staff together and getting it to be a cohesive unit who can really win games for you. I think Sonny Gray will do that, but I think the rest of the rotation is a big question mark. You have the Brewers, who are very interesting because they just traded Corbin Burns, their best player, and they lost Brandon Woodruff for the year. They did re-sign him though. You have a good young core, but nothing that's going to be really great and that's going to get you into the playoffs like the Brewers teams of the past. So I'm very interested to see what happens with the Brewers this year, if they become a full rebuilding team or retooling or even compete. I doubt that, but again, crazier things have happened. So I'm really looking forward to the NL Central this year, and I think the Bellinger signing really just pushes that ahead to my interest level and what's going to go on. So, yeah, that's our first segment, talking about Cody Bellinger of the Cubs, some market movement finally. So, yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens with that and see what happens in the future. So we're going to go to a break here, but before that, we're going to talk about our next segment a little bit, which is going to be updates on the market, updates on the other free agents still out there, how does Bellinger affect them, and just that kind of stuff as well. So, yeah, we're going to take a break, but we'll see you after that. So, thanks.